Devil's Advocate Studios presents Gamers and Goths Midnight Podcast, the Satanic Panic and its effects on gaming and popular culture. Hi everyone, welcome back to G&G, the place to be for everything that's not
D&D. I'm Eliza.
And I'm Jonathan. Today we're going to do a deep dive into the darker, deeper, and more mysterious side of tabletop role-playing games, popular culture, and goth life.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm sounding a little sexy there, huh?
Nice. Today we're going to be stepping into a particularly eerie chapter in the gaming history and the infamous Satanic Panic. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Satanic Panic was a wave of moral hysteria during the 1980s that wreaked havoc across gaming communities, particularly those involved in Dungeons and Dragons, but it also touched on other games like Vampire the Masquerade, etc. later down the road. It was a time when fantasy and fear collided in a very real and dangerous way.
But before we get too far, be sure to leave a like and a comment. And please consider subscribing to the channel so that you can stay up to date with all of our upcoming content.
And if you like what you hear here, don't forget to click the bell so that you get immediate notifications every time we drop something, and hopefully when we drop your favorite topic about gaming. Also, baddies, don't forget to go support us on Patreon. We love you all over there, and we're excited about what we're doing, and we're so grateful, as always, for your support that you show to us. Go over there if you want BTS content, early access to episodes like this, and even some bonus discussions, maybe some uncut clips or bloopers, as there are definitely plenty of those. And yeah, just joining the community to have a little bit maybe more say-so in the polls regarding the topics that we talk about. So go over to the Patreon. We would love to see you there.
All right, so the Satanic Panic wasn't just about gaming. It was a full-blown cultural phenomenon. I kid you not. Mm-hmm. The idea that satanic cults were infiltrating everyday life, corrupting children, and performing dark rituals started popping up everywhere. It affected everything from music, movies, day-to-day life of children, adults, in schools, and in churches. But what's most importantly, it wasn't based off of any real evidence, but it still spread like wildfire through media and religious groups and even law enforcement.
Exactly. And a big part of what fueled the panic was the fear and ignorance that Satanism was somehow hiding in plain sight in all of these things. This wasn't just about fantasy games like D&D. The people were convinced that rock music, horror movies, certain toys, like Power Rangers and even My Little Pony, cartoons, that they were all somehow secretly pushing kids towards satanic rituals and beliefs. Parents, teachers, pastors, and even political figures started seeing signs of Satanism in even the most innocent things.
Pokemon was probably looped into that.
Oh, yes. And one of these days we will have a whole conversation about my very traumatic, weird childhood. So like I said, Pokemon, My Little Pony. I remember even at one point, Barney and Elmo, people were having concerns about Sesame Street. It was a thing.
I don't remember that, but
it was because some YouTuber had made something.
Oh, okay. Well,
about like demonic Barney
okay,
singing about putting children in ovens. It was a thing.
But you see, it wasn't just limited to fringe beliefs like the fact that Barney was evil on YouTube. This panic, though, was mainstream. The media played a huge role in amplifying these fears. Shows like 2020 and Geraldo. God, I remember Geraldo. Now he's like a legitimate newscaster. Back then, like he had like, anyway. They ran special segments that were sensationalized and supposed these satanic rituals. And these stories were presented as real, credible threats. Suddenly, families were on high alert, watching for any sign that their kids could be corrupted by Satan.
And even reached into the legal system, which is crazy to me, that there were actual court cases tied to these insane feelings of fear. Most famously, the McMartin preschool trial, where a group of teachers was falsely accused of ritual child abuse. This trial became a symbol of the mass hysteria surrounding satanic cults, and it really showed us just how deeply these fears affect people's lives, real people's lives. Families were torn apart by these allegations, and innocent people were put on trial based on nothing more than paranoia.
I'll tell you, I actually saw the TV movie about that trial, Eliza.
In real time.
Probably, I don't know if it was real time. Like, I was too young. It was
not too far after.
It was on TV, and to my little self, that was real time. I don't know if it was a rerun.
Valid.
Was it the first run? I have no idea.
Closer than me.
But yeah, no, I was pretty young, and I remember they talked about the sacrificing of rabbits. Yeah, I know it was wild. Like, so I remember they would, like, in the court case during this dramatization, like the prosecutor would be like, oh yes, and then they would sacrifice the rabbits to convince the children to stay silent. But then the next day they would have a new rabbit to convince the children that they had the power over life and death. And, you know, I think I was probably like 6 at the time. So I was like, oh my God, they're killing the rabbits.
I know, not the rabbits.
Oh yeah, no idea. But, you know, it's just wild to think about how this panic has influenced at the time, still does, so many aspects of our culture. Music, for example, got hit really hard, especially bands like Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath. I'm not a heavy metal fan, but I'm pretty sure Kiss. I'm not sure if they used to say the KISS acronym was Knights in Satan's Service. That's what they used to say.
I know about that.
I'm not even sure if it's true. I haven't even looked that up.
As someone who grew up in the church, yes. It's funny because I knew nothing about KISS except after I went to youth conferences, and then I was a fan.
oh, okay.
But it was more that, like, they would try to show us these things and convince us they weren't cool, and that was the worst thing you could have done for a group of teenagers, is put up on a screen something that looked really fun and rebellious and cool and said, don't do it. And we were all like,
we're going to do it.
We're absolutely
totally gonna do it.
Going back to the hotel later and we're going to do quote unquote devotions. No, we have YouTube. We're looking up a KISS concert.
Oh my God. Okay, but yeah, this is also too, I think, I don't think it's a satanic panic thing, but it was a thing that kind of became popular again. Backmasking. The belief that you could play a record backwards and then reveal hidden messages. Hidden satanic messages.
I'm embarrassed to say I tried that once.
Oh, you did?
Listen. When you're a very religious, sheltered child, you don't know what's real and what's not, so you have to test it yourself.
Oh, I mean,
to find out, because your parents are never going to let anyone test it for you, and they are never going to do it. And I remember, I think I was 11 or 12, and I went to a sleepover, and my friend was like, we should see if this is real. And I don't remember. We picked some CD. It might have been Celtic Thunder, which, if anyone knows what Celtic Thunder is, it's literally just a group of guys that are the version of Celtic women. And we tried to rewind it to play backwards with the hope that something would come out of it, because there's a part of me that wanted to believe it. I think that was the Gothic part of me that hadn't been fully awakened yet. So yeah, I mean, I guess we can take that as actual evidence here. You played it backwards, and now look what's become of you. See, they were right. Never mind. Everyone run. It's real. It's real. But you know what? It wasn't just heavy metal. Funny enough, pop music got dragged into it too, which is hilarious to me when you look at drag music of this time, and it's so bubblegum pop. The fact that there was this weird fear that anything rebellious, anything at all, especially if it came to a darker aesthetic, was part of some larger satanic conspiracy, which is hilarious to me. I can't even get my friends that love me and care about me to come to a game on my birthday consistently every year, let alone be a part of a collaborative mass conspiracy. But even artists like Madonna, and I know for a fact Britney Spears and stuff like that, they weren't immune from... We're talking about the 80s here. I'm sure Britney Spears probably... She was in Disney Club? Mickey Mouse Club? What the fuck do we call that? Oh my goodness. Anyway, keep going. I'm sorry. Along with Zac Efron. But they weren't immune from these accusations that they were somehow pushing the satanic messages in their work. Yeah, and the effects of the Satanic Panic weren't just about pop culture. It hit communities on a personal level, especially within, I say they can't see me pointing to you, but I am pointing to you, Eliza. Religious groups, churches became ground zero for a lot of the fear, with pastors, no doubt,
you're a pastor's kid, warning the congregation about satanic influences. I don't know why I get so dramatic every time. The satanic influences everywhere. Some churches even had they would cleanse homes of evil, and I like how my notes here say cleanse. It should say exorcise. The power of Christ compels
But the proper
you.
term, we don't use exercise. That is a Catholic.
Oh.
Cleanse is the more Americanized Baptist term.
You know, I tell you the thing that the Baptists got to get with the pageantry here. Come on, get the stuff.
But that's part of the sin, don't you know? That's part of the sin of Catholicism. Okay, well, I'm telling you right now it is.
But anyway, and they also, burning rock albums and Dungeons and Dragons book burnings and everything else. They would just burn whatever's suspicious. You can't burn CDs, but you can melt them. I think.
Yeah, reading through this is reminding me how abnormal my childhood is, because I'm like, oh, I remember going to burnings at junior camp.
Okay, all right. And now with that, we're demonetized because you sound like a Nazi. Keep going. Keep going.
But yeah, it was a really bizarre time to be in anything even remotely alternative or imaginative, creative play. Imagine this, though. Parents, schools, and churches across the U.S. and other countries even started to believe that D&D was a gateway to devil worship, the occult, and rituals. All of it, the whole 9 yards. The media picked this up, obviously, as the media always does, had all these wild claims, and suddenly, if you were a kid rolling a dice in a dungeon with your friends in your parents' basement, you were supposedly dancing, if you will, with the devil.
I like how you said there, you're like, you're rolling the dice in the dungeon in your parents' basement. I was like, your parents' basement has a dungeon? Mine had a pool table. That's all. And that was after we got remarried. We had a pool table. Anyway, I know what you meant, but I was just sitting there thinking, like, who has a dungeon in their basement? Again, and the more I'm talking to you, I'm like, oh my God, this shit's real. Anyway, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
You're fine. It really escalated, though, after the Dungeon Master.
Hello, it's Jonathan from the future. Just to correct a small mistake that we made, Patricia Pulling actually wrote the book The Devil's Web, Who is Stalking Your Children for Satan, in 1989. The Dungeon Master, The Disappearance of James Dallas Egbert III, is a book that was written in 1984 by the private investigator William Deere. We'll talk more about James's disappearance in a few minutes.
A book by a mother named Patricia Pulling gained attention. Her son, unfortunately, tragically committed suicide, and she blamed D&D, claiming that it was a direct influence on his decision to take his own life. This led her to form BAD, or BADD, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, an organization that actively campaigned against the game. These parental soldiers leading the front.
Two things on that. It's like a play on the acronym MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, which legit group. I'm not sure if they're still around, but when I was a kid, that was everywhere. So I think just even having that added a sense of legitimacy to this ridiculous organization. I am sorry that this lady's child committed suicide. But
obviously parents in grief, they want to blame something, and secondly, this just happened to be that.
And secondly, The Dungeon Master, if it were published today, would be like 50 Shades of Grey. Like, that's what the book would be. The Dungeon Master. That's what I immediately went to. No? Do you know
I would need to go reread both of them to compare.
It's okay. First of all, don't read The Dungeon Master, because that's a book where they're just blaming D&D for evil. I've never read 50 Shades of Grey, but I do know my mom read it next to me while we were on a plane to New York.
I don't know how much I need to know about
it. Was weird. It was like, Mom, what are you doing? Anyway, so yeah,
I will tell you right now that 50 Shades of Grey is nothing near the demonization of D&D. They are not intersectional in any capacity.
It made me laugh, just the idea of a book being called The Dungeon Master. I'm like, nah, that'd be some bad smut this day and age. That's
that I will be publishing soon.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, there we go. We get reclaim it for the geeks.
Yeah. See?
Because there's going to be a dungeon in the basement with dice. There we go. Okay.
Roll the dice harder,
but anyway,
baby.
yeah, no. So BAD and its misguided crusade was all just, based off of wrong information. There was no evidence that there was any real world connection to like any satanic practices at the
nothing credible
at that trial and all of that. It was just panic. Everybody was just scared, like the Red Scare and so many other scares in the past. Speaking of which, have you heard of Mazes and Monsters?
I have, but I cannot tell you anything about it. It's one of those titles that like is thrown around the geeky community and you either have seen it or you haven't, but you've all heard the term.
Yeah. So Mazes and Monsters obviously is a play off of Dungeons and Dragons. Okay. So it was a TV movie that aired in 1982. So at the beginning of all this, and it was based off of a novel by Rana Jaff. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. The novel itself was loosely inspired by the disappearance of a college student named James Dallas Egbert, who was believed, incorrectly it turns out, to have gotten lost in the steam tunnels of Michigan State University while playing Dungeons and Dragons. The story about his disappearance became national news, and the media kind of quickly tied it to, as they always do, Dungeons and Dragons. And that, like, if you play D&D, you could have some real life consequences, like getting lost in the steam tunnels and dying. I think they ended up finding him too. I didn't research that part for this, but I believe they ended up finding him. Anyway, so the author took that narrative and spun it into this movie, Mazes and Monsters. And the story essentially goes around this college student who just gets really into fantasy. This fantasy game called Mazes and Monsters, clearly the stand-in for Dungeons and Dragons. There's a character, Robbie, and he is played by a young Tom Hanks. Very young Tom Hanks. Very, very young Tom Hanks. I don't even know if this was before Big, but it was definitely before he got big. Do you know there's a movie with Tom Hanks called Big?
Yeah.
Okay. I just didn't know if I was hitting that cultural point there for you. Anyway, so Tom Hanks / Robbie starts to lose his grip on reality and starts believing that he's living inside the fantasy world of the game. His delusions lead him into life-threatening situations where he's convinced he has to level up. He's got to level up in the real world.
Level up.
Yeah, which involves wandering in dangerous situations like the city's underground tunnels.
What are you doing? Going to join the Great Hall.
You can't. It's a trap.
I have spells. I'm going to fly.
You don't have enough points. I am the maze controller.
So yeah, the movie, and like I said, you got to understand, because it came out in 82, and I actually saw this when I was a kid. Now, I was not born in 82, so I saw this later, and so this was after the time probably Tom Hanks was a big name. So it came out right at a big time. It's on national television. Everyone's talking about it. And suddenly years later, oh my God, it's Tom Hanks. This has to be legit. So yeah, it just, it portrayed D&D and, well, specifically D&D, or as they called it, Mazes and Monsters. This is dangerous activity that could just warp your mind and cause you to lose touch with the reality and potentially commit dangerous and violent acts. And we'll talk about another dangerous and violent act in a future episode. But it basically just reinforced the fears that everyone already had the early stages of the Satanic Panic, because we talked, it wasn't just about gaming.
Yeah.
There's this idea that satanic cults are everywhere. At the time, in the 80s, this Ronald Reagan was president, and there was this concept of the silent moral majority.
Yeah.
Kind of. So it really just played into that there's this weird thing that was causing people to, essentially, go crazy. So yeah, after that, kind of you throw Tom Hanks, TV movies, and TV movies were huge at the time. I mean, that's kind of like, I guess now the equivalent would be like streaming movies.
Well, I was going to draw a parallel to, maybe a later generation that understands a similar thing on a lesser scale. But of course, the Blair Witch Project, it was a movie that was totally different. We had never seen a horror film in that sort of format
I'm not
before.
sure if it was that kind of connection as it was that different, but it did.
Well, what I was going to say
people.
is so many people did not really see it as a film that was fictional. They saw it as a sort of documentary of real life, and there was this immense fear suddenly of Wicca and paganism and, people that were very fringe spiritualists in nature that participated in those things. And like, I remember growing up when Blair Witch came out, there were a lot of people that genuinely believed this was a real movie of real people, and they took it extremely seriously. And especially someone who grew up in, like I said, a small rural town in the Midwest that was highly religious and, they don't always take those things separately. Fiction and fact are very real. Just kind of drawing that parallel here for maybe a different audience, but the timing of mazes and monsters in particular just couldn't have been worse for the tabletop RPG community. It just came out right as the Satanic Panic was really gaining its momentum, and it just continued to feed into this narrative that role-playing games were something to be feared, that they were something dangerous and vile, and it didn't explicitly mention Satanism, the movie didn't, but the idea that these games would lead to these psychological breakdowns and these dangerous behaviors and violent outbursts, that was enough for people to raise red flags, specifically parents, and especially, again, in more conservative and religious communities.
And we were talking again, it's the early 80s, and D&D was less than a decade old at the time, so no one really knew what Dungeons and Dragons was. You either knew it because you played it, or I'd say there's a third person, like you knew somebody that played it, but not many, or you had never heard of it. So no one had any idea of what it was about. So this, the ignorant, which was mostly everybody, could easily, go, well, what is this? Is this about? And especially if you saw the old art and stuff like that, especially like the monster manuals, like, oh my God, lots of demons and stuff in there. Yeah. So
it wasn't the granddaddy of gaming that we know it is today.
Yeah. So, but when the movie Mazes Monsters came out, it like you said, to some people it wasn't fictional because they didn't know enough about it. To them, it was a documentary. Like, oh my God, this is this new strange thing out there on the street called Dungeons and Dragons. Where are your kids tonight? I remember those like PSAs.
I kind of love it. I love it a lot. And it didn't help that the movie just leaned into all of the misconceptions about the gaming community. As we know, it even though it is much more mainstream today, there's still so many misconceptions about the gaming community and the geeky communities as a whole. It portrayed all the players as socially isolated, emotionally vulnerable, and immature, easily swayed and lost in these imaginary worlds that they were creating, instead of seeing it as a creative outlet where people were going for community and escapism. And it just reinforced that stereotype that the people that play things like D&D are lonely, troubled children and adults, and that they're somehow all spiraling in this, dangerous fantasy on their way to a psychotic break.
Yeah, but the movie was fictional. At the end of the day, I mean, it had Tom Hanks in it, so, it had that going for it, but it really just kind of, to sound like I'm writing a freshman level English paper here, it really, how do I say this? Made people aware and anxious about the cultural changes happening around them. Well, it didn't matter if it was, heavy metal, horror films, or in this case, role-playing games. It really just was that fear of the culture changing around them. Like I said, Ronald Reagan, the moral majority. The world's changing. We don't know what to do. Anything that's different, that is bad.
And this was a time like after a lot of big cultural shifts. We had the first, second wave of feminism. We were seeing a lot of artists coming forward for the LGBTQ plus community, and there were all these stereotypes. And I feel like this was just one more thing, but it was geared towards children. And that was the first time those things were really geared towards kids. Everything else was walking away from the 1950s. And suddenly the next generation was not just adults that people assumed were ill or crazy. This was, oh no, this is shaping our kids. Yeah. This is the first generation truly walking away from this post-war home that's very conservative and follows these social norms. It was like, in my opinion, when I look back at it, everything leading up to that point was very adult-oriented, and adults participated in it. Things like heavy metal music and everything, that was coming up with like the younger generation. I think that really freaked all the older people out, because they were like, oh no, it's not just adults we disagree with anymore. These are the kids and grandkids I love.
Well, it also sounded, if we're talking about the music, it sounded different than what came out of Woodstock. And it sounded different than what the disco, like heavy metal was different. It wasn't just Elvis, repurposing African-American rock music.
Yes.
It was different. Oh my God, what is that electric sound? Ow, ow,
Why are they screaming?
Yeah. Yeah! Welcome to Los Angeles! We're back! Have you heard of Jack Chick? Because I knew his work, but I had to look his name up for this here. He was an artist who wrote anti-D&D comics that really just whipped the religious conservatives into a fervor. It's funny. I think as I look in this up, a lot of his comics really weren't about Dungeons and Dragons. I think there were just like 2 or 3 of them, but it really I remember them. Or at least have seen them, but it essentially told parents like, oh my goodness, Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games, they are Satan's propaganda to get your children to worship him, and it's dangerous, things like that.
And a lot of these comics were passed around at like church revivals, which if you grew up in the religious community, that's sort of the bread and butter. Revivals,
Didn't you say
conferences.
They had like a fancy name?
And yeah, so a lot of these sorts of arts were a part of tracts, TRACTS. And what those are, they're little pamphlets that are very thin and unassuming a lot of times now that people are very creative.
They were like smaller than checkbook. I think
they're very,
like
the idea is
checkbook.
that you could slide it into your wallet easily. You could slide it into a miniature Bible, like the ones that you would see in a like hotel, the New Testaments that they leave in drawers. The idea is that it was no bigger
the
than
Gideon
that.
Bible? Is that what it's called?
Yes, the Gideon Bible. And the idea was Christians and religious people, they really truly believe that these are tiny little slices of the gospel. And the whole idea is you take tracts and you leave them everywhere. You leave them at public bathrooms. You leave them in restaurants. People would specifically go to concerts. They would specifically go to conventions. They would specifically go
to D&D
places.
Games.
Well, no, that was the idea, is that you kind of were planted. You were a mole. That was the whole idea. And trust me, I was raised, this is what we train people to do. The idea is that you're a mole. The only time they encourage you to like be a public school teacher and not a Christian school teacher is with the idea that you are going to be one of the soldiers on the front lines. You are in the highways and hedges. And this narrative, 100% was placed into all of those pamphlets, placed into all those teachers. I remember hearing about people going into public schools specifically to take care of this stuff, to spread these around. But yeah, no, funny enough, the Bible college boom in America actually was started and was happening during the Satanic Panic, and they were hand in hand with each other. Part of the reason that we saw Bible colleges booming is because parents panicked. Their teenagers were playing things like D&D and suddenly wanted rock music, and they were like, no kid of mine is, and so there was a huge influx of people that never would have sent their kids to Bible college.
All because of D&D.
Not specifically,
but
yeah, let's blame D&D.
Yeah, I mean,
the media has already been doing it forever.
Yeah. Well, this is the place to be for everything that's not D&D, so we've got to throw it under the bus, right?
Very true. But yeah, that we see a huge boom in Christian ministries. A lot of them really latched onto this idea that games like Dungeons and Dragons were leading their kids astray and directly into the hands of Satan.
Into the arms of Satan
himself. Papa Horns.
Papa Horns. Okay.
You had pastors condemning these games from the pulpits, youth groups, holding burn your D&D book events. I have participated, not for D&D, but for other things. And it's crazy. It's real for people that are like, no, that would never happen. Yes, it does. And entire ministries shifted their focus 100%. For a time towards their congregations, away from these perceived threats, these games that they saw as these gateway drugs into, like
Satanism.
I said, the arms of Satan.
So, yeah, and I know you know this better than anyone, Eliza, but I'm kind of just saying it for the listeners, is that, religion is a huge influence on people. I think we know it, but we don't know it. And to use, because you're listening, I assume you're into role-playing games. I love fake religions and how it influences the culture. And we're going to do like a whole thing on just religion, I'm sure, and how neat it is in an RPG, because, real people will die over it. But the point is, you get these religious elements pushing this idea. It is just insanely powerful.
Yes.
That's for sure.
Yes. It is important to note, though, that this was not just some fringe belief. This is a mainstream, as we know, the United States, and especially during this time, is, for better and for worse, a Christian-leaning nation. As on a whole, it is just societally acceptable. People that don't believe in God and never go to church, really, they'll still put out a manger at Christmas. This is just a social thing. Because of this, major Christian organizations, publishing houses, radio shows, televised ministry programs, they just started picking up on all this media because ultimately at the end of the day, it's a business first, but we had, big religious leaders like Jerry Falwell, Jack Hyles, Bob Jones, the list could go on forever, and so many others within these major evangelical movements. And they went on to warn about these, demonic games, claiming they were morally corrupting and leading the children from their Christian values. And the reach was huge. I mean, you had Christian bookstores carrying books labeled TTRPGs as dangerous tools of Satan.
Which is funny because I got my first role-playing game from at least labeled a Christian bookstore.
What bookstore?
I think it was Walden Books.
Oh, Walden Books is like the hallmark of Christian bookstores.
Gotcha.
It's
Christian
primarily,
light.
yeah.
Just 1 calorie of Jesus.
It's more like everything else is the cheat day, and you're here for the vegetables, which are Jesus.
Gotcha. Okay, gotcha. Okay.
But even some schools banned these games.
Yes,
I am someone
I
who
do
went
know
to a
that.
school that these things were totally banned.
At my school, it was close. Like, it was definitely, I was...
Borderline.
I brought my RPG books to school, mainly because I was the goody two-shoes, and I think most teachers were like, oh, well, he's reading and done with his work. Why would I stop this kid?
Yeah.
But my friend... who just name I won't say, just for them, my best friend from high school, he got her. I remember him going like, hey John, can I see your book? Can I see your book? I'm like, no, you can't. You will get it taken. No, I won't. Dude, you are the bad kid in class. And sure enough, one day I gave it to him, and actually he almost got it taken, but it was actually a friend of mine who's like a year or two younger. His got taken. The teacher looked at it and took it. And then he was told, like, you're not allowed to bring that stuff to school. But I kept getting away with it. But that's because I read it. I was, how they have students as like the office workers.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was literally sitting in the office reading my Vampire the
They're not
Masquerade
paying
book.
attention to you.
Well,
You were not the kid they were worried about.
Exactly. Yeah. So anyway, it's funny. Christian books, that's just, And no, you talked, no, that's we already passed that.
Banning,
Yeah.
And you and I have sort of talked about this because I experienced the isolation in a different way. It was communally.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of, I would say, were a part of the more normal mainstream sort of isolation that came
what
from
I
this.
think most people, or at least people who weren't completely religious, when they think about kind of the stigma that a gamer had, someone who played these games, I would say that you have two different perspectives. They're either the nerd that's got like 4-inch thick glasses and is like excelled at calculus
and has a lisp.
Yeah, there's that guy, and then there's the weird, dangerous one. Because at the end of the day, no one was scared of that kid. He was just, to him, that guy just had a weird math book and just had too much of an active imagination. Is when you were past that, you could almost be normal, but you're not quite. You weren't on the football team. You weren't so hardcore nerdy that Anyway, so yeah, you're right. I definitely did experience those kind of things. I would definitely have people, when I tell them that I would game, they would often have things to say like, oh, do you, because I played Vampire, as any young goth kid should, especially a young goth gaming kid should. Like, it's like issued to you, like, oh, here's your black shirt.
Here's your nail polish, your eyeliner.
I
and
never
BTM.
had nail polish. I don't like drawing on my hands. Anyway, but like I went to Hot Topic. They gave me
Here's
my
your
shirt.
bag of spikes. Attach it how you will.
Yeah, they gave me my black shirt, and here's your Vampire the Masquerade book. Oh, But anyway, but yeah, no, I definitely experienced kind of the stereotypical stuff of like, oh, do you think this is real? Oh, okay, that kid's a nerd. But yeah, no, it was definitely isolating for a teenager to be like that because the churches thought you were weird or evil, and then your family thought that, and we'll go into this more in another episode when we talk about it, that like there were other parents that warned my parents that I would kill them because I was into the so luckily for me, I was a goody two shoes and was really able to push past a lot of that, especially after people got to know me. But there was always that, especially at first, that
Yeah, and it's kind of crazy how long this has continued to last. This is not something that necessarily is over. We still experience the ripple effects that this panic really stretched well through the early 90s and even into the 2000s before it really started to truly die down. But the damage is already done. Like, gaming groups had already been driven underground, conventions were canceled, heavily scrutinized. So many TTRPG creators and writers were, faced a lot of heat and, potentially threats. Like, as someone who grew up in a very religious, it's not uncommon to go out of your way to find out where someone lives and find a local church that's, willing to go to people's houses. Like, I've seen people picket fence personal homes and buildings. It's, I cannot imagine being in the heat, like peak time of that.
Yeah, no, the sense of shame and suspicion definitely sticks to the community and the players in it for many years. I've already talked this, started in the 80s. In the 90s, I think it moved away from D&D and definitely hit Vampire the Masquerade.
For sure.
And we'll get into, the vampire murders and Vampire the Masquerade in another episode. But it was hit real hard because, it was a gothic, darker game. And it was about personal horror, mortality, and, vampires. So, yeah, it was easy to freak people out because, blood, all that other stuff. So the Satanic Panic crowd was already there, though. They were there because it was in the 90s. There was some tragedy, but they were there ready to go with their metaphorical torch and pitchforks. Yeah, 100%. So it's just, it's kind of sad because I didn't get into gaming to join the occult or anything like that.
Yeah.
I didn't want to join and or found a cult. That was a joke. I worked my first job because I really played a lot of games. And by then, everyone kind of, I was the goody two-shoes. So one of my coworkers would be like, oh, hey, John, how's your cult doing? I'd be like, oh, it's doing fine. And what he really meant to say, oh, your games, you still playing your games? Yeah, I'm still playing my games. Like, that was it.
Yeah.
But I didn't get into it for that. I got into it because I was a nerdy kid that really loved movies.
You were a theater kid.
Yeah, I loved that. And to me, I was like, ooh, I can tell a story. Nowadays, we've got all this cool equipment and stuff like that.
We've got Roll20.
Well, no, I meant like we were on professional mics. Like back then, like you couldn't get that as a person.
Yeah, no,
like, you couldn't build a creative story on your own. It had to all be in your head. But here was a way you could do it. And you could do it with somebody else. You didn't have to explain, okay, so in my world, vampires do,
Yeah.
It was there. And it was really just a chance to tell a story and in a way to have a community.
Exactly. And I think on the flip side, it really just like galvanized the community in its own way. And I will say it now and I will say it again. You will all hear me say this. I will never be that person who says that trauma is good because strength came out of it. And I don't believe that that's what happened here. But to see the way that the community rallied together, there's so many people that stood up and said, like, no, this is our space. These games, they help us tell stories. They help us escape. At the end of the day, everybody who joins these communities is looking for creative connection, found family, the intersectionality of human beings that falls under the gaming space, LGBTQ+, people of color. There are so many people that have felt isolated and find themselves and find other people, particularly in this space. And like you said, it's about telling stories and being creative. And I think especially for adults, when you get out of school, it is so hard to continue those creative outlets. It's expensive. It's exhausting. Where's the time? This is a way to do that. This is a way to continue to be imaginative and playful and joyful. And I think at the end of the day, people misunderstand why people join these communities. They're here to play a game and have a good time and connect with other human beings at the end of the day more than anything else. It's to evoke joy and to create joy.
There was, as the Satanic Panic was really, at its full force, game designers had to make a decision to try to take the heat off of them. So they kind of rebranded things. Dungeons and Dragons renamed the demons and devils. They had different names, but it wasn't until later that they kind of brought it back. They still kept their old names because, like in Dungeons and Dragons, demons are like from the chaotic plane, devils are from the lawful evil plane. Like they're different. They actually have like a war. Anyway, my point was they rebranded, but they never really lost sight of what these things were about. They didn't change what the game was about. They just had to file off some serial numbers here and there. And it's kind of interesting to look how far the TTRPGs have come from then to now, from being demonized in the 80s to becoming this massive cultural phenomenon. I mean, we have Critical Role, Stranger Things, and TTRPGs are mainstream now. Heck, there's even whole podcasts about it, where people get, have too much money and decide to buy a bunch of equipment just to talk about it.
It's kind of crazy, isn't it? People do that.
Yeah. There you go.
And, the gaming community, they took the backlash and then they turned it into a rallying point.
Yes.
And while the Satanic Panic, we consider it a part of the past, like I said before, it is important to remember the ripple effects and the impact that have come. I can't imagine the amount of isolation that people experienced and the mental health that has come from that people are still healing from. We see it every day. That's mostly where the gatekeeping comes from. People feeling like, oh my God, like suddenly it's cool. How dare you, when now you still look down on me because I'm not a specific type of gaming person.
Yeah.
And we'll dive into that. And so I think
it can be a whole
it's important to remember, just like any cultural shift where people kind of, to sound a little dramatic, rise from the ashes, to remember that like that's where we come from. And because they endured that, we can have this today. We wouldn't have Dimension 20. We wouldn't have Critical Role. Stranger Things would not be promoting this. This would not be trending on TikTok if people hadn't stood together and gone through that, and creators continue to pursue forward.
Well, those people that grew up with it, now they're the cool the cool people. I'll say that, and they're the people that are writing our culture. They're the ones that are doing making the movies. That someone who played D&D sat down with, and I'm not, in the writing team of Stranger Things, and decided to put that in there and to kind of normalize it. And I'd say if you talked about, that it turned into a rallying point. One thing, as I got older and kind of just figured out who I was, I game. Yeah. And it was very much like, I never really, I stopped hiding that. Like
it's a facet of yourself.
It's who I am. But I'm still gainfully employed. Too much employed. I work too much. But
workaholic. Yes.
Yeah. And I'm relatively well adjusted. Lord knows I'm not a perfect person, but I'm definitely not terrible. People we'll talk about in another episode and things like that.
I think you're wonderful.
Well, thank you. I like to think anyway.
Because I love you.
Oh, I love you too, Eliza. But yeah, it was, it became a part of me and it became a rallying point. And I know I can't be the only person who felt that way.
And I know you're not, because one great thing I think about like having different, time frames of people at your table. You've been doing this for 20 years. I'm in year 3, 4.
20? Anyway, keep going. Yeah, thank you.
And I do see it in our table. The gamers, the people that they did this as teenagers and grew up with this, and now I see myself bringing my friends who are newer and at their first tabletops. Now I'm GMing. Like, I never would have seen that for myself, and it's so normal to me that it's kind of crazy to think that at one point I would have had to be like afraid. But
hiding in your basement.
I completely understand that, though, with my upbringing in different ways. And so that's like the one thing that does make me the saddest, is the idea that like it's already really hard to be a teenager. It's a really hard time of your life. And the idea that like where you meet friends and stuff, if you're not the person that can get into sports, if you're not the person that can get into music, if you're not the person, like gaming makes a way that everybody from every level of intelligence and ability can come together. And that's like, it's beautiful, and it's crazy that people were so insane about it.
Yeah, it's a strange chapter in gaming history for sure, but it's one that we needed to talk about, and especially to remind people that, kind of the bigger point of this is that, fear and misinformation can have real consequences. We're getting near an election cycle, or we're in an election cycle, and when you're listening to this, I guarantee you in the next 4 years, hopefully, if things go well, there will be another election coming, and you're going to be dealing with the real world effects of misinformation and fear. So in its own microcosm, we can take this lesson from the gaming community and apply it to
that strength. I think it's like I've told students that I've had in the past before in my teaching career, the thing that you're good at, take the strength and the ability and the confidence from that and channel it. And as gamers, I know it sounds kind of silly, but we should do that. The same passion and charisma and confidence and strength that we have, together as a community. We should really rally together on the whole, and I think that's the bigger picture, and I'm getting really cheesy. But it's important for us to continue to be protective of the spaces that bring us this joy and escapism and community in a correct way. Not talking about gatekeeping, which we're going to get into in another one, but they're not just games. Like, yes, it's just a game. It is just make-believe, but it's so much more, and it represents so much more for people every day, every week, all the time, and it's important to keep those spaces safe and inclusive and still stay open enough for us to grow, because hell knows there's plenty of growth still, which you all will learn very quickly about.
Well said, Eliza. Well, for anyone listening, or perhaps still if we've gone on too long here, we'd love to hear your thoughts about this piece of TTRPG history. Did you experience any of the fallout from the Satanic Panic? Did you live through the Satanic Panic? How's it shaped your view of the gaming world today? Or if you were outside of it, and you're somehow listening to this, how has your perspective changed? Maybe why has it stayed the same? That sounds interesting as well. I feel like as long as you don't hit us with just 2 barrels full of Jesus stuff, we'll listen. But let us know in the comments below, or share it. I mean, you can just post it anywhere and talk about what you want. Either way,
100%, depending on which application you're finding this on.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, share it to a gamer friend that you think would enjoy. If you went through the Satanic Panic and you're like, oh my God, my best friend did too. Send this to them for some nostalgia. We would love that. And continue supporting us on our Patreon and other places so that we can bring you more dark and nerdy discussions. There's always a lot more to explore. We love digging into gaming history and uncovering all the new TTRPGs that deserve spotlight. And hopefully, if you're a subscriber and on the Patreon, you'll participate in a poll and we'll do your favorite.
Well, thank you everyone for listening. Until next time, roll your dice, light those candles, and never let fear stop you from embracing what you love.
Bye, baddies.